Hi, everyone. My name is Steve. This is my friend and esteemed colleague, Mike.
Hi, everybody.
Mike and I have had lots of conversations about what's happening around the funding cuts to the self-advocacy organizations in the province of Alberta. And we thought what we do is just have a conversation about the impact on it and what our opinion is and point of view. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay, so
we want you to have a better understanding of how this decision will impact people with disability, as well as the government economically as a whole.
yeah, and I think it's really important for us to point out the fact that we're not doing this conversation or putting it on our social media to actually slam the government or to critique them or anything like that. However, we do think it's really important for people to have a good understanding of the scenario and the impact on it and why we think self-advocacy is so important. So we're presenting it from 2 points of view. Mike's point of view is based on his lived experience and his involvement in these self-advocacy organizations. My point of view is based on my years of working, supporting folks with disabilities. It's certainly not as a reflection of our organizations that we're involved with, but strictly two Albertans that have a point of view that might perhaps be shared with our friends and colleagues. So, Mike, why don't you start off by sort of just reviewing exactly what the cuts were and how that came about and what happened?
Yeah. So there's many disability advocacy groups in Alberta, but the three that we are referring to when we talk about these cuts are the Disability Action Hall in Calgary, the Health Advocacy Federation in Edmonton, and Southern Alberta Individualized Planning Association and Health Region Health Advocacy Network in Lethbridge and surrounding area. So in January 7th, all three organizations got a letter from our funder, which is PDD and procurement.
PDD, story, Mike, stands for Persons with Developmental Disability.
Thank you.
It's the funding source to support folks with disabilities in Alberta.
And so we all got a letter saying that our 3-year contract, which isn't set to expire until 2026, would be would end in April 2025. So 15 months before it's set to end.
So my question to you about that process, was that a surprise?
It was a huge surprise. The ally with the Health Advocacy Federation, Kerry McEachran, who does the kind of main email for the organization. She actually got the email about 5 minutes before our meeting was set to start on Tuesday, January 7th. And she actually had to leave the meeting because she was just in complete and utter shock. And we just renewed our contract in November of 2024.
Oh, okay. So this contract was renewed in November 2024.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to be for 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the concerns I have with that is the process for actually, informing you about discontinuing the contract. And I wanted to ask you how that made people feel when all of a sudden, without any correspondence or any engagement or any conversation, it just happened.
Yeah.
Did they actually consult with you beforehand?
No. It felt very cold-hearted, especially coming from procurement. Like it didn't even come from our PDD caseworker. It came from procurement who most of the people within the organization, the disability advocates, don't really have a relationship with procurement, like any relationship whatsoever. So to us, it felt very cold-hearted and distant and mean-spirited, really.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, and so that's good to clarify that, because I think people need to understand that it wasn't even a respectful process, right? To just continue funding for people that actually it impacts on their lives.
Well, the other part of that too is like, all three organizations basically have existed since 1998. Disability Action Hall was 98, SAF was 2006, and SAIPA SRSAN was 2001.
Okay, wow.
And so we started in the Ralph Klein era, because he saw a value in people with disabilities having a voice and having a connection to government and being able to help government understand like how their policies would impact our community.
So you're saying that actually that these three organizations have been around for over a decade at least, if not more.
Yeah.
And they were created during the time that Ralph Klein and his party was in power.
Yeah.
Okay, and they were the Progressive Conservative Party.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for me, as someone who's spent 40 years advocating for folks with disabilities, and I like to think I work hard actually at ensuring that they have people are being seen and have a good quality of life. When I first saw that happening, the most challenging thing for me was to actually try to wrap my head around the rationale for that. And I think the comments that came out, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on that, is where the minister came out and said that there's no funding cuts for direct support dollars for folks with disabilities.
I actually want to clarify one thing as well that's really important. When we first got this news, actually, the excuse that procurement gave us in the original letter was that the disability advocate and the Premier's Council on the Status of Persons with Disabilities are advocacy groups, that they do advocacy. Both of those groups of people are advisors to the minister and to the Premier.
Correct, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the Premier's Council has never, ever been told that they need to advocate for folks with disabilities. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if you go to their website, the word advocacy doesn't even exist.
No, it says advisor.
That's right, they advise the government on what's happening in the disabled community.
And even, a friend of mine is on the Premier's Council, and they were even surprised that.
So they weren't aware of this either.
No, it was a surprise to them too.
No, so number one is the process itself, the way it was communicated was really disrespectful, and not really efficient.
Yeah. In
my mind, because it caught everyone by surprise and there was no consultation. So it's not as though that the funding sources were actually consulting with you about this and giving you a heads up. It just they kind of made their decision on their own based on what they felt was needed and what wasn't. And so to me, again, that says that they didn't really value the work of the self-advocacy organizations. And I think we need to talk about the impact that these organizations have on the lives of folks with disabilities and the positive impact, because I think it's important for people that don't work in the field to understand that their existence and how they help out. So could you share some of the benefits?
Yeah, I mean, first, I want to give a little bit of a history, because one thing that we're very aware of is that some people hear the word advocacy, and they think, well, no wonder the government, doesn't necessarily want to fund advocacy. But self-advocacy, self-advocate, was actually a term that was coined by the disability community, because at one time, parents and guardians and gatekeepers would speak for people with disabilities on behalf of us, rather than letting us speak for ourselves. So self-advocate was a way for us to say we are speaking for ourselves, we are advocating for ourselves. So these groups, they provide tools and resources to not only help people learn how to advocate for themselves, but giving them that platform to be able to advocate for themselves. They also create community. They, bring people with disabilities together and allow them to build friendships, build relationships within their own community.
Okay.
I want to say one more thing. We work with government. Well, like I just said, we worked with government since the Ralph Klein era to ensure their policies are accessible and hopefully in plain language for people with disabilities, and for them to learn how their policies will impact our community. And finally, we help alleviate the strain on the mental health system by offering peer-to-peer mental health.
Okay, so I'm glad you pointed that out. So some of the benefits aren't just to advocate and
No.
to give people a voice so they could speak for themselves, but also to support folks in areas of mental health and just general living skills.
Yeah.
And so, and that's good. That's really important. And one of the things that people are going to say, well, isn't that the role of service providers? So what's your opinion of that?
I think in a way, as somebody, who has been part of a service provider before, they did help with some of that, but the biggest piece that they didn't really help with was community and helping to build and nurture that sense of community and bringing people together. It was more about, oh, I have to go and do this today, so they would take me to go and do that. That's not what self-advocacy groups do. They help build people's confidence.
Okay. And from a service provider point of view, and I'm glad you brought that up because when we talk about direct support dollars, I think people need to understand that direct support dollars is pertaining to exactly what the outcomes of the contract are for. So for instance, for those agencies that provide employment support, you get a specific number of hours where you support people in job search, creating resumes, interview practice, etc. Anything along a continuum from job applications to sustainability at jobs. So any of those hours that are allocated are used specifically for employment support. So do you think it's safe that that supporting people with general living skills, like applying for applications, say for a bus pass or any of those issues that come up, including mental health, I think it's almost safe to say that those are an addition to the support that people are required to support.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense? So if I have 20 hours a week for for employment support, all of a sudden you requires another 2 or 3 hours per week for additional support on your mental health.
Yeah.
Then I think sometimes employment agencies or agencies in general are actually constrained by their contract.
Yeah.
Because they're not providing the hours of support based on those outcomes that are in the contract. And also, so there's that piece there that is that I don't want people to be under the illusion that, hey, service providers can pick up the slack, because they can't. There's also the ethical narrative and the philosophical narrative that goes into that. And so in the disability world, since the 70s, right, there's been a strong movement towards community living movement, people living in the community, accessing community, being part of the community, not being on the outside looking in, but actually being part of the community. And so that's been in existence for like a number of decades. And I think one of my worries is that the government made these decisions, but I'm not quite sure what it was based on, because it certainly wasn't based on feedback from service providers or for self-advocates or for families. And so their intent of why they did this, to me, kind of raises a lot of questions, because if they're looking for cost efficiencies, which our government falls back on, and rightly they should, because they're responsible for that. This move that they made actually is not cost efficient. It actually is going to cost us more money in the long term. And can we just chat about that a little bit and give people examples of that?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, for example, like I said, self-advocacy organizations help people with their mental health, and so it prevents people from having to go to hospital, to go to shelter, to even during COVID, I got to be part of a really great project where we actually um, we looked at the issue of isolation and people feeling isolated, and we were able to get a grant through FCSS in Calgary, and we were able to get tablets to people and teach them how to use it so they could connect with their community. So we help with mental health in a lot of ways.
Right, and that's not any different for those folks who identify as not having a disability, right? During
Yeah.
COVID, their loneliness is really becoming a real big issue for a lot of people because they're isolated. And in fact, our research has shown that even meeting virtually does not replace meeting face to face. And so, again, my worry on this is that it's going to further stigmatize people, but also isolate them. From someone who's been involved in the supported employment field, one of the biggest issues is those biases that employers have about folks with disabilities, that they're not capable of jobs, that they're always going to need support, they're always going to be dependent on us. So I've spent 40 years actually working really hard to dispel those myths. And but again, my fear is from a point of view, and I'm being really selfish as someone who supports folks with disabilities and finding employment, that this actually is going to be a real hindrance and become a real barrier, because obviously when you're applying for a job, you got to be on your game. You have to have a really positive outlook on what you're doing. You have to have the confidence in yourself. You have to be focused. Those things are an important ingredient of a successful placement. And my worry is that we're going to be spending a lot of time working on these other issues rather than looking at what we're supposed to be doing for people. So I'm pretty confident that I can teach you to do anything, but one thing I can't teach you is to have good mental health. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it would be really presumptuous of me.
Well, actually, you do actually help me have good mental health.
Well, I think, and I think part of that is about the relationship,
Yeah.
right? Respect goes both
Yeah.
ways. It's reciprocated. I learn from you as much as you learn from me. And so again, those dynamics of those relationships is really what creates success in life.
Yeah. But I was just thinking about this. Steve and I actually did another podcast together where we talked about the idea of self-discovery and the idea of helping people, well, with disability or anyone, find out and learn what their skills are, what they're good at, what they're passionate about, and all these things. Self-advocacy groups literally do that. Because if I hadn't joined a self-advocacy group, I wouldn't have learned how to be a public speaker. I wouldn't have learned how to, write professional communication. I wouldn't have learned how to effectively, talk to government or other people.
Absolutely. Actually, that's a really good point.
I wouldn't
right?
have learned how to sit on a board for 9 years.
Yeah, and I think that's another good point to point out is another role that self-advocacy organizations have is to provide resources for people to develop these skills.
Yeah.
Another reality I think people need to think about is that when you work for an agency that provides employment services, that it's always term certain, right? What I mean by that is I'm not going to support you the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
I'd like to. It's not that I don't want to, but our relationship can evolve and change, and that professional relationship is not ever ending.
Yeah.
And so again, my fear is not all organizations have this in their contract, but a lot of organizations have contracts where we support you for a certain period of time, and then that's over and you're on your own.
And that can have a really big impact on some people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Not only just the safety mechanism, the safety umbrella, but also the fact that a year from now, 2 years from now, I mean, this is not unusual. And this isn't just with folks with disabilities. This is with all of us.
Yeah.
Is that there's going to come certain times in our work life where we're going to need additional support. We might need additional accommodation. So again, those conversations that people are going to have in the future with their employer that's another good example where if you're involved in an organization that helps you develop your own self-advocacy skills, you'll be able to advocate for yourself moving forward. Now, if you look at it from a cost-effective point of view, it makes sense for me that if I find you a job and you're working at a job, it's going to become really expensive for me to support you in the next 5 to 10 years that you're working at that job.
Yeah.
Versus work supporting you for 2 or 3 years, but also then recognizing the fact that you have other resources to support you. And so if you're looking at it from a cost efficiency point of view, and then correct me if I'm wrong, the 3 organizations total received grants of approximately $425,000.
Yeah.
And we estimated that those 3 organizations support an estimate of 800 individuals.
Yeah.
So you can imagine if you take that number of individuals and you divide that by the number of hours that they're going to need for support, and then times that by the amount of hourly wages that we give our staff to do their jobs, it's actually going to cost more than $425,000.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Would you agree on that?
I would.
So from a cost-efficient point of view, I think really our funding sources and the decisions they made were a bit short-sighted, because you and I are looking at the long game. As we should when you're dealing with human beings. You should never, nothing's ever a quick fix. And so I would be really so bold to suggest that perhaps one of the biggest issues that came about with this process is they didn't really consult with people. And they should. If I was going to look at ways to make things more cost efficient, I would bring you into the conversation to say, like, how can we work on this together? And that working together collaboratively or collectively, there's a lot of characteristics of that, right? It's mutual respect, it's ongoing conversation, it's working together collaboratively. And so again, in the spirit of community, none of those characteristics that I actually described were carried out.
No.
This isn't a podcast or a conversation about pointing fingers and saying you're wrong, you're bad people, or anything like that. But I think it's really important for us to discuss exactly what the impact is in a really professional, respectful way, to make sure that people out there actually are aware of what these impacts are. Because as Albertans, I have a very clear picture of what I want the powers to be and what I want my communities to be. And I want them to be inclusive. And this whole process and their decision was simply exclusionary from the beginning to the very end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people with disabilities have a saying, nothing about it without it. So the fact that we weren't consulted, we weren't talked to in any way, shape, or form, and there was no, communication. Yeah, it's hopeful.
Okay. And so again, getting back to the point that you and I firmly believe that it's quite easy to point fingers and say you're doing something wrong. It's a different story coming up with calls to action and strategies to work on this. So let's talk about some of those strategies that you and I could work on to actually make this a lot more positive. Such as asking for the money.
Well, we held the 3 organizations, and we can put a link to it below or above, whatever. The 3 organizations created a letter writing campaign on a website called NewMode. So you click on a link, and it will take you to a page where you can fill out the form, put in your information, and there's a letter below that you will send it to Premier Smith, to Minister Jason Nixon, and to your own personal email. Okay,
so then people that you and I both know, our friends and colleagues and people that are linked up with us in social media, we could give them a template of this letter, and they themselves could actually send it in if they were to support us. Yeah. How effective do you think that is if we get community to support us on this? Do you think it'll have an impact?
Oh, 100%. You know, that's one thing that I've really taken away from this, and you know, in the bigger picture of things, is the sense of community and the sense of how many people truly do care about this issue and truly want to help the disability community and support us through this.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because, you know, if we want to create communities that are really inclusive, we have to include everyone.
Yeah.
So then, you know, having saying that, you know, this lack of funding to support self-advocates really is an exclusionary process that stops people, and it's a barrier for people that belong to the community.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, which in turn would spill into an increased mental health services, a whole variety of different issues that might come up with this.
Yeah, well, including houselessness potentially, because people don't have that community that they can lean on, right? So if they don't have that community they can lean on, if they have barriers to finding housing or obtaining housing or even, you know, getting housing, then that can be really bad, and they can end up on the street in shelters that frankly are not made for people.
And then they have to access other services,
Yeah.
which may be more expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there, we sort of presented a really good economical case on why it's really important to have the self-advocacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And so, you know, one of the strategies I think is writing those letters, but also perhaps engaging with our funders about this to explain the importance. Have you reached out to the people responsible? Have they responded back to you?
Yeah, we have, and the organizations have met with those people. Minister Nixon has said that he's open to a conversation with the Self-Advocacy Federation. So we'll see what comes out of that. Well,
okay, good. So Minister Nixon actually is willing to have a conversation about this.
Yeah.
Okay. And obviously having more people write letters would really help as far as influencing the decision he makes moving forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, my friend.
Thank you.
I was good. I'm glad we had this conversation.
Me too.
Mike and I are going to be probably, we recorded this video, we're putting on our social media, and I will attach that link for that letter. And I really, really encourage my colleagues and friends that are on my social media channels, and I know Mike's going to do the same with his, if you really, really help us on this and support us. So if you believe that community it really consists of everyone and not just excluding people, then please help us and write those letters and send it off and voice your opinion.
Yeah.
Because you are Albertans.
Yeah. We would really appreciate it, and we thank you for your support.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.